Hi, welcome to the Addiction Recovery Place podcast, the podcast champion addiction treatment professionals around the world. I'm your host, Chris Langley. I'm very pleased to introduce today's guest, Nancy Johnson from Virginia. Nancy is a licensed professional counselor and licensed substance abuse treatment practitioner who's in private practice. Nancy's done clinical work for 47 years, and one of her specialities is codependency, which she's worked with personally and professionally for 35 years. Welcome to Addiction Recovery Place podcast, Nancy. It's so great to have you with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. That hits a lot of marks.
Excellent. Well, we're looking forward to hearing about your work, that's for sure. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk to me today. So I'm sure our audience are going to really enjoy listening to you today. So let's get started, Nancy. Can you tell us about yourself and your career?
Yeah, so 47 years. No one wants to sit and hear me describe all 47 years. I will say that the stories I'm going to tell today about my work with codependency, Chris, weave personal and professional. So I'll start with the professional. I came out of graduate school in a counseling psychology program, working with adolescent juvenile delinquents. I was as their therapist. And I quickly realized, and this is the late 1970s, how many of them had problems with alcohol or problems within their family system with alcohol and some other drugs as well. And my field, my graduate program had not taught me anything about addiction or substance abuse. And in that early part of my career, I realized that I couldn't help them as a mental health therapist if I didn't also know something about addiction and recovery. And so that's what I did. I set off to gain my own parallel knowledge base on addiction and recovery. And that's been part of my whole career, is having my feet in both mental health and in addiction. And there's not been a lot of us who do that straightforwardly. I carry licenses in both fields, but I recommend to anyone studying to become a therapist these days that you know both areas of work, because they inform each other, and my mental health is affected by addiction around me. So while I was realizing I needed to know both of those areas, I got involved with someone who ended up going into recovery for alcoholism. And in the course of their going into recovery, I realized that I should participate in a 12-step program for family and friends of alcoholics. And my doing that then took me out of the professional world and started at a very slow pace. And again, this is the early 1980s, waking me up to my own issues with codependency. When I went into that 12-step program, I had no idea. I actually thought I was going to support the recovery of someone else, which in those eras, that's part of what it was to support the recovery of the other person. But I had no idea the extent to which my overhelping, overgiving, overmanaging, overfunctioning, not in a blaming way, and that's going to be a very important dynamic that I talk about today. It's really important we not blame codependence and see it as things your fault. It's more that I turn the focus on myself and understand the things I am trying to do to help actually aren't. And they are not only not helping, I am not taking good care of myself as I overextend for somebody else. So in those first sort of half dozen years of my career, I started integrating, as I've already said, addiction work into my mental health work, and then my awareness of the codependency. Al-Anon has an outstanding phrase in its welcome. that really guides a lot of the work I've done for 35 years on codependency. And that is, we keep the focus on ourself and not the alcoholic. Now, I'm all about balance, and you're going to hear me talk about that. In this case, balance of focus on others and focus on self. But that notice that we keep the focus on ourself, I actually describe it as a billboard for a lot of the work I have now created that evolves into what I call self-recovery. So there's a 47 years in a nutshell as a rough sketch of things, how it sort of started.
Goodness me. So you entered a 12-step program just to go through that experience, and then you
Oh,
come out with this
no, for my own recovery.
for your own
Okay,
recovery.
when I
Yes.
entered it,
Okay.
when it's Al-Anon, when I entered it, it was not to have that experience. It was after a meeting or so, it was realizing I had work I needed to do for me that would help me be weller. Absolutely. And therefore, the person who I'm describing ended up being my husband. And we shared 38 years of sobriety. As I've said to you, he passed away this past year, but all of those decades were him in sobriety and me gaining greater understanding of myself so that we could have a more balanced relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that to me, Nancy. I really appreciate that. I'm obviously very sorry to hear about your husband. We're just going to move on a little bit. Your speciality, codependency, is very specific but really interesting, because when we first met, I've never come across this model before. So can you tell us, can you tell our audience about codependency and how you work with your clients, please?
Yeah, so I imagine many people watching this podcast know that codependency emerged as a topic in, I would say, around 1985, 87, with Melody Beattie's work called Codependent No More. And it really is a useful book in that it was the first announcement or helping us to see this issue of what I call loss of self in others, Chris. Let me actually, I'm going to use, when I teach codependency, I often use my circles to explain what we are talking about. I see a relationship as two people. This is a self and this is a self. We want a healthy connection with self, who we are, and our own boundaries. This person has their own self and their own boundaries. In an unhealthy relationship, for the most part, what we have are enmeshed relationships. These circles overlap in a way that myself and their self is not individuated. And often we stay stuck there. Codependency can be really an enmeshed relationship. I know a lot of the current literature on research studies. I've made that my business because I've written several books on it as it's gone on. And actually, it's interesting. I can't find her name this second. She is a London person doing a lot of really good work on talking to people who identify as codependent, and they describe those relationships as enmeshed. So enmeshed would be this, alienated would be where we're in a relationship, but we're really not interacting. What we are looking for, the third dynamic, is a healthy relationship where my sense of self and this sense of self, we do our own work, and then we're able to come together and intersect however much we want, share whatever we would like for our relationship, keeping our connection with ourself, though. So when we need to set a boundary or do something, we can, and acknowledging that this other person has their own self that's different than mine. I think often we think people have to be, that I'm right, or you have to be like me, or you have to know what I know, or do what I do. But in fact, it's healthy that we're acknowledging the individuation of the other person as well, and honor when they need to step aside. So a healthy relationship has this nice, even flow that I say involves mutuality and respect for self and for the others as well. So how this relates to addiction is profound because, again, it was first identified in the addiction field. We first called the family members co-alcoholics. That was the partner, the spouse, perhaps a parent even, that was inadvertently, and this is so my spirit, inadvertently contributing to it. Chris, I'm going to say, I keep talking about the importance of non-blame because codependency fell into its own little dark hole. So we learned about it, and then people started feeling like it was blaming the person who was the codependent, and that it was creating a very negative image of them as an enabler and them being at fault. And even now, bringing the word into our fields in a way, and this is what I'm working actively on, in a way that says, no, this is a real dynamic. We really lose ourselves in someone else. Our balance really can be off. And therefore, it's really important that we look at it as not as a pathology, but just as a way of being that has helped us in the past, perhaps from family of origin, but does not serve us well now. Ideally, Chris, this is an adult to adult relationship. So if I bring it into the recovery world, which is easy because I'm doing that all the time, codependency is much broader than we see it in much broader ways than just addiction now. But if each person is working on their self in a healthy way, this person, let's say it's the codependent, the person in recovery from codependency, really wants to be working on their own recovery and letting this other person do their own recovery as well. Now, there is the interaction, and there's some good schools of thought about how that can be helpful. But what I'm sharing with you and our population today, meaning the people who might be listening and watching, is that it is super important. This person may be able to help this one, but this person needs to do their own work for their own health and their own sake. And that's pretty much what I do. So I learned a lot of stuff through counseling, my own, receiving it, and 12-step work in Al-Anon. And then in the late 90s, a client was leaving my office, and said, I had used an Al-Anon phrase, detaching. And she said, Nancy, I understand what you mean by detaching, but how do you do that? And Chris, as a therapist who really likes to work at deeper levels with people, I thought it was an outstanding question, because whereas we know detaching is, I would say, shifting away from being reactive and creating enough space so that we're responsive, that is a lot of work, actually. We really can't just say to someone who's used to rushing in and helping to do that and it stick. It's very good, but how do we do that? That's why with 12-step programs, we say keep coming back, because it's hard work. So that is one way to learn these things from the Al-Anon program. But through mental health also, and I've expanded the work. I've brought the wisdom of 12-step into mental health. And so I did that. When she said, how do you do that? I think my whole body of work opened and expanded in that moment. And I jotted a quick list of internal things to do. that I realized a lot of people could benefit from. Because as the day went on, I saw, again, I'm talking about codependency as losing self in others. Another way I talk about it is overfunctioning for others and underfunctioning for self. And I could see that theme in a lot of other people. So I ended up creating groups that poured into a handout that ultimately poured into my first book, which is Disentangle, When You've Lost Yourself in Someone Else. This first came out self-published by me in the early 2000s. And then Central Recovery Press picked it up. It's a great press. They have many, many recovery books. And they picked it up. And this is the second edition that we've done of it. This came out in 2020. And it's full of skill sets in 4 areas of facing illusions, detaching, boundaries, and spirituality. And it really is about how do I cultivate self that doesn't lose myself and stay enmeshed within this relationship. And recovery, the difficulty in addiction, and I think of addiction way beyond substances. This could be addiction in a number of process addictions as well. I don't want my addiction to the addicted person to be a problem for the relationship, for the person, or for myself. And it's codependency at its far end can present as compulsive and obsessive, which we also call addictive. Yeah, yeah. So briefly, and then we'll spin off of that. Then I created it by 2011. My life as a border collie, freedom from codependency, and it has a very different take. It's metaphorical stories, but about my border collie and about codependency with lessons learned. And again, it's all to strengthen self. And then it's all evolved into this book that came out in June of 20. I'm sorry, this June of 24, from PESI, PESI, Professional Educational Services Institute, where I'm actually training therapists to understand and think about how to think about codependency, diagnose it, and then a full detail of treatment ideas in it. It also invites us to look at ourselves as a therapist and to pay attention to how our own codependency can come into play as we're trying to help someone else. And in doing that, if we're not careful, we can be not letting, we want to foster their growth, not their growth we think they need, but the growth that is true for them. So it really, many helping people do well to pay attention to their own overfunctioning for others.
Wow, that explains it so well. It really did make sense, and how you explained it with the circles as well, with how relationships are intertwined.
Thank you. The circles have been a part of my work forever. They started out just me drawing them on a flip chart, and then I started doing talks in bookstores, and I was like, well, I don't want to carry my whole flip chart in. And so I cut these out of, for anyone watching who wants to use it, go for it. I teach at conferences a lot, and I go to some store that has office supplies, and I buy plastic file dividers that are colored. And then I cut my circles out of them. And I have a whole raft of different sizes, and I hand them to clients to work with to describe the relationships and what they're trying to do as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can see how that works very, very effectively, Nancy. You mentioned your great workbooks that you've done. Can you tell our audience about this work and how it was received by other professionals?
Right. So thank you. What I would say is, well, I am not um, a total national name at this point, but I am teaching at a national level for PESI. I do webinars, really once a month, 6-hour webinars that are training clinicians in how everything I'm talking about and the workbook content that is training them. And Chris, it's really interesting. I don't know that there is another workbook training clinicians. And I really appreciate that this PESI has been so interested in me training clinicians. So I always have very good attendance at them. When I speak at a conference, I usually limit my numbers of attendees in a room to 30 or 40 because I'm interactional and I like conversations and I always fill the room. People have been really, I would say in the last half dozen years, there's been, and I know we talked about this. I know it's something we're going to chat about. I call this the next era. We are in what Nancy Johnston is declaring is the next era of codependency recovery. So the first era was Melody Beatty when she brought forth Codependent No More. That book is still millions, sells millions. I mean, it's still really popular. And we started paying attention to it. And really important other people wrote about it. Pia Mellody and Claudia Black are two pioneers that I should cite. Sharon Wegg Cruz. You may have listeners who know all of these. Where these are people, when all of us who were working in the self-help world then knew some of these names who were helping with early codependency recovery. But then somewhere in the 90s, the next era moved in, which I've already spoken of, where it was perceived, as I've already said, in as blaming. I'll just keep it simple, as blaming the codependent. And so people don't want to identify as codependent because that has a lot of negative connotations. I don't think the intent was that it happened that way, but it did. And so things quieted down in it. And but what I understand has happened, and my current experience out in the world, writing and teaching and marketing, is that there is an increasingly strong interest in it now. This is the new era. I would call it the third, where younger people are just like, what is this? And how it's playing. There's a whole lot going on with relationships with narcissistic people, with toxic relationships. And I think that that's where, not to blame, but the dynamics of being so externally focused can cause us to get stuck and tangled, to use my word, Chris, in these relationships that aren't serving us well. And so I am trying, and I do feel like I'm being received well, to deepen the clinical work we can do with folks who are, as another way, I keep using various language, other directed. They are, as opposed to self-centered, they are other centered.
That's amazing stuff, how you've kind of taken it to another level and you've got a new generation of therapists now that are acknowledging your work.
Chris, that's a great way to put it. It is a new generation, and they are interested in my lifetime work on it. Yeah. And so I am running some self-recovery cohorts online. And those are small. Those are for not just therapists, but anyone who would like to deepen their work on codependency and have a healthy relationship with self. And I think in the winter, I'm going to start a clinician's consultation group with people who want to learn more from me directly, who might have the workbook and want to learn some of the nuts and bolts and talk about some of the problems they are running into as they use that material. Or, hey, how about successes they have? Yeah.
Wow, big plans, Nancy. That's for sure. Um, when we first met, you told me that you went to the United Kingdom, and obviously, being a London myself, I was very interested to hear your work. You've worked with some fellow British organisations, and Noel Bell, who I've obviously heard of, who's one of the UK's most prominent psychotherapists. Can you tell us about how you went to London to speak to these services and professionals?
Oh, it was a lark. It was an easy thing. I was traveling with my daughter who was photographing a dance company out of Chicago, and who were performing in London and down in Brighton, and I had, because sort of as a pioneer of what I'm doing, um, I had been paying attention. Sometimes we Google ourselves. I don't know if you've done that, but I'm okay. Let me be clear. I don't do social media. Everybody, I do LinkedIn, but I'm not on social media. Um, but I will Google myself. And Noel Bell had written a blog, and he was working with the stuff from the Border Collie book. And I was like, well, that's cool. Who's Noel Bell? And so I reached out to him, and he and I have a couple of interviews on YouTube. He has a really good understanding and interest in the topic. And so if your listeners are interested in two, clinicians talking about it, I was in London, so we weren't across the pond. I was there. And so it was just enriching to get his to have those conversations. But while I was there, I had picked up the names of some people. I think I knew about them because I had presented here in the US at the in Hyannis at the Cape Cod Institute for Addiction. And the UK had its own parallel institute. And I had picked up some names there of some folks with Step to Recovery. And so, again, if we don't promote ourselves in some way, the world won't know what we're doing. And I'm just trying to have, so I reached out to Steps to Recovery, and they were great. And they were like, "Are you here?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, they had a residential house. "Do you want to come for the afternoon and do a workshop with our staff and with the residents here on Disentangle?" It was on Disentangle because, Chris, we're tapping into an important thing, and that is codependency is not just it's in all of us, actually, to various degrees. And people in recovery from other addictions, I have been told often at conferences that it can be a cause of relapse. That if the person is not tuned into their own losing self in other people, some either relationship they're pursuing or tangle in a relationship can lead to a relapse of their own addiction. And so that's what Steps to Recovery were all, I mean, they totally understood that, as does Noel, and wanting their residents who were recovering from probably substance addictions to also have this piece on relationships and codependency recovery too. It was great. I felt quite at home there and quite familiar. I know we talked about wondering the difference between services there. Well, I really can't speak to the differences. I'm not that well informed. I can just say I felt at home. I was with my people in recovery who know mental health and addiction, who were smart and caring, and we all spoke the same language. And it's a great place to be when that happens.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was amazing that you were able to go and talk to a service in Britain about your expertise. That must have been an amazing
Yeah.
experience for you and for the residents. I mean, that's
Yeah, well,
incredible.
Noel wrote an endorsement for the workbook. He wrote an endorsement for the second edition of Disentangle as well. So I stay in touch, and haven't been back over. Many things have kept us all, like a pandemic. But I'm open to talking to whoever is interested. and training wherever I can. I will say, though, Chris, that's where PESI's work is great. Anybody in the world can listen to and watch or purchase the webinars that I do for PESI.
Can you? Yeah, actually, we're going to ask about PESI now. Can you explain this organization and how it works and how it helps professionals?
Right. They are in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and do lots of training for licensed people and for clinicians. It was interesting. I was on the NADAC morning, whatever the post board is, and somebody had written, "How do I get my CEUs?" Well, I'm not here to sell for PESI. Let me give that as a disclaimer. But what PESI does is it does offer a wide assortment, a broad assortment of classes that you can take to, and it's for licensed people so that we can get our credits, our continuing education units for whatever our certifications and licenses are. So that's what they do.
Fabulous, absolutely wonderful. Because you mentioned this organisation to me before, so I was grateful for you explaining that to me, Nancy. You told me that you've been given, many talks at conferences and online presentations. Can you tell us where you've spoken in the past and whether you have any more talks scheduled for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I have, as I mentioned, been at the Hyannis. I let it slip out of my brain again. But I have commonly presented regionally at the Virginia Summer Institute for Addiction Studies, the Virginia Counselors Association. I presented at the American Mental Health Counselors Association, the Carolinas a conference for addiction recovery. Oh, I'm sorry, the Cape Cod Symposium. There it is. Thanks, Cape Cod. Um, yeah, and everything I do, every opportunity I have to teach, is not just teaching the people in the room. Their questions inform me about understanding what helps me to recover. How do I connect with myself in mind, emotions, body, and spirit? I want to at least throw that out, Chris, as a fundamental, very fundamental treatment thing. We get caught up in our thoughts or we get caught up in our emotions when in fact there are at least these 4 areas of self to pay attention to. Mental health has done so much to bring the body into focus. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score really has woken everyone up to the importance of how my body is responding to stress, to worry, to trauma, which can well be a source of codependency. And so part of my recovery model, I mean, this is a drop in the bucket because there have so much, is to think of these 4 areas of self and help our clients learn how to tune into all 4 areas of self. So back to your question. So when I'm at a conference and I'm teaching any one of the skills, I do get good questions that then make me stop and reflect. Why does this work? How did I get here? What might make it a little different? Yeah, decades ago, early on with Disentangle, somebody in the audience said, "This sounds like it's an attachment theory issue." And attachment theory had not reemerged. It's old. It comes from the 1950s, but we were not seeing it so comprehensively in our work as we do now. But when that person raised that issue, which is, do I have a secure attachment or an insecure attachment? And are my insecure attachments feeding my codependency? Am I seeking a secure attachment, but in ways that are not helping me have a secure attachment with myself? And certainly with them, I'm making them run away, or hide, or go away, or drink more, or use more, or gamble more, or whatever. Not blaming. So when that conference person said, it sounds like attachment issues, and I was like, I was informed in that moment, again, more than 20 years ago. And I started paying attention to it, researching it, and have been fascinated. It has deeply informed the self-recovery work I do with codependents. So, so my biggest teaching right now is monthly for PESI on my webinars, their webinars, our webinars. But I will be at the Psychotherapy Networker Symposium in Washington, D.C. next March. And am teaching a 3-hour session there called Understanding and Treating Codependency. And the subtitle that they chose to use is When Your Clients Overfunction for Others. So I'm really looking forward to this really large opportunity, Chris.
Yeah. So that's coming up in March of next year.
Right.
Wow. Wow. Well, congratulations for everything that you've done, and to be invited to so many conferences and to have these experiences to explain your work, and it's just must be an incredible experience. And well, congratulations on that. And
thank you.
Just finally, Nancy, you organize a codependency camp, and this year you're celebrating its 20th anniversary. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so Codependence Camp, we just did our 34th camp over 20 years. Don't do the math. We started off doing it once a year, and the campers said, and I understand why they said we need it twice a year. I pause and really offer a serious thing. I think no matter what we're recovering from, it requires daily connection with the work that we are doing. What are my goals? What am I focusing on? What are the tools I am using? What will support my use of those tools? I think we can go to a conference. We can go to camp. I'll circle back to that in a minute. We can go to Nancy's online cohorts and be inspired, learn, feel connected. But we can click off, and we have such deep habits, whatever those are, and I'll keep angling. I can talk it broad in mental health, but I'll talk about it from an addiction angle. We have deep patterns within us that if we do not have a daily way that we are practicing or staying connected with our work, we will be, it will make, we probably cannot change those patterns. We are creating new neural pathways. I won't teach neuroscience here, though I could, but and so it's so important that we have these daily practices. So camp, we went from once a year to twice a year, and now I have the cohorts, and some campers also attend the cohorts. Again, always trying to increase, because the world invites us to be back in our habits. The world expects us to be, okay, I'm going to say it two ways, expects us to be who they know us to be. But more importantly, if we don't bring self-awareness, we will fall back into those very patterns ourselves. We will offer when we need to say no. We will carry a conversation longer than we need to. We will step in and take something out of somebody else's hands when they've said, I've got it. If those are our patterns, what are we doing to stay in touch with them on a regular basis? So camp is always about learning new skills, but also reinforcing what we are working on. Chris, we keep it small. It's myself and my colleague, Margaret Kress. She and I work extremely well together, and we keep it about 8 campers. We will have up to 10 at times. It's an overnight camp, so we don't have but so much space. We meet in a living room. We have shared meals around the dining room table. We have about 10 hours of workshops that we do. It's not group therapy. It is workshop format. And I'm a clinician enough to know how deep we're going to go or not for the time and the situation we're in. I'm always, to be frank, my codependency presents itself as having, and your listeners may already have noticed, too much information, too much knowledge. We go too far. And so it's cute. So at camp, I'm almost always have too much information, and I don't want to do that. So I'm listening to my campers and seeing where we're at. and because I want them to leave also calm and connected with themselves and what they're taking with them for self recovery.
Wow, that sounds an amazing experience. That really does. And I'm sure the campers really appreciate and experience every moment that they're with you, because this is really, really powerful therapy model that you've got here, Nancy. That's for sure.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
Well,
Thank you.
it really is. I'm really enjoying this conversation, Nancy. One of my final questions, and I ask all my guests this, and it certainly relates to what we're speaking about here, but I get some interesting varied answers to this. But can you tell me your opinion of harm reduction and how codependency can have a role in this?
Hmm. Yes. So I'm not involved in harm reduction services,
No, no, I
nor am
know.
I an expert in any way with it. I will say, I think it totally has a place, and in this, I think that we mental health often is learning how to live in the gray as opposed to all or nothing. And codependency often operates out of all or nothing. You do this or you hate me. I offered this to you and you certainly will do that for me. But if we talk about, say, substance addictions, I do want to say that I do think abstinence is the path some people need for recovery. I would not, and I see the value of meeting a client where they are at. So I'm informed, I'm trained in motivational interviewing. Interestingly enough, Chris, I use it in treating codependency too, because I want to meet the client where they're at and see what they are willing to do for what, yeah. And it actually, that also relates to stages of recovery, and which are, I'll say very briefly, and your listeners, many know, pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, and relapse. We are often working with people in the pre-contemplation or contemplation. They don't even, especially with codependency, they don't even know what the problem is. And so if we jump in too far down with action, but they aren't there, I don't think that treatment wise, we're going to meet with the success that we need if we meet them where they are, help them see where this could go, and join them in that. Now, the other thing I will say about harm reduction and codependency, again, I don't offer it. So conversations are welcome about it. I think any person providing care needs to be aware of their own codependency and to be responsible for, am I doing this for me or is this helping them? Am I really listening to them or am I taking it on my hands to do it for them? And I think no matter where a person is in their recovery addiction, in their addiction and their addiction recovery, I want to be empowering them. And I think that's where we have to be really careful about our own codependency, that it isn't disempowering our client, even when we're trying to help.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad I asked that question, Nancy, because that was a great answer and very relatable to codependency and harm reduction. That's why I asked. I think that's a really interesting answer. So thank you for that. Do you have a message, Nancy, for anyone who's listening to this podcast who's going through addiction or going through a mental health trauma?
I think that the door that opens recovery, I'll summarize with, I have I have what I call ingredients of change, but the top three are what I'll talk. I think we have to have awareness first, honest, realistic awareness of how we are and how our behaviors and what we're doing are interfacing with the life we're living. So awareness is everything. Awareness, awareness. The second one comes out of program wisdom, and that is willingness. Okay, so I see that me buying all of these things and filling my house with objects and boxes is now crowding me. Am I willing to pay attention to perhaps a spending disorder, a spending addiction. Okay, I just pulled that out of my head as an example. Am I willing to do? And the third one is intention. If I'm aware, if I'm willing, and then I need to, what am I going to do intentionally? Am I going to get to meetings? Am I going to do daily readings? Am I going to attend workshops? Am I going to find a friend who is also in recovery or who also understands me? Am I going to give myself homework assignments that in between my therapy appointments? So awareness, willingness, and intention in that order. And I find often that we blossom in awareness, and then we have to spend a lot of time with willingness. And that's where some of the deeper psychological things are. You would think that we would want 100% to change, but that's not true. We have these old patterns, and we have to dig deeper to understand. I do parts work as well. We have to understand what parts of me aren't willing and get to know those parts before I can be intentional. But do something to be intentional too. So that's what I would say. Awareness, willingness, intentionality.
Yep. Wow. Nancy, could you tell our listeners how best to contact you and to find your services online, please?
It would be through my web address. I'm sorry. Yeah, my website, which is Nancy L. Johnston, all lowercase, .com. NancyLJohnston.com. There's a contact on the tabs at the top there.
Yep. Well, we'll make sure that there's a link in these videos and all these podcasts, Nancy.
Great.
I'd just like to say it's been a real pleasure talking to you today, Nancy, and to finding out about your extensive career, your wonderful work, and how it relates so much to addiction. It's been a real privilege to talk to you today, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for all your great questions. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Nancy.